on risk management on a Monday evening. So thank you all for making time for this. I've got some slides which I will run through, but then, as Leslie says, I hope that we'll have a bit of time for discussion and questions before we get to the end of our time this evening. So I will just share my slides. Hopefully you can see that. Lovely, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk just generally about risk management and the way we think about risk management in United Learning. Most of what I'm going to talk about, in fact pretty much all of what I'm going to talk about, is set out in our risk management framework, which is available on the hub, and I will share the link with you at the end. We've had a group risk management policy for quite a long time, but over the last couple of years, in discussion with trustees, we've done quite a lot of work to really develop that into something that hopefully sets out reasonably clearly but quite comprehensively our overall approach to risk management. All of what is in there is stuff that we've been, none of it's particularly radical or particularly new, but as a document, it attempts to set out our practice so that we are really clear about how do we work in managing risk, how do we think about risk, and how do we do that both at a strategic level but also at an operational level at the centre as well as at school, as well as in schools. So the document itself is I think if you haven't read it already, it is worth a read. It comes with a handy summary document, which is contains the same basic stuff, but is quite a lot shorter. But that's broadly speaking what I'm going to talk about this evening. As I say, none of it is particularly groundbreaking, but it hopefully kind of gives us a way of thinking about risk, as it gives us kind of common language and common approach to the way that we think about risk. So I'm going to go through kind of for some of you, I suspect some of what I talk about will feel kind of relatively, might feel a little bit basic, but I think it's really important that we all have that common understanding, so that we can then in the way that we're thinking about risk and you're thinking about risk with your LGBs, you're doing so in a way that's linked to the way that we're doing that as an organisation as a whole. So some real basics to start off with. Risk is fundamentally the variability of outcomes. So the more uncertain the outcome, the more risky the activity. And risks can, of course, although we tend really to think mostly automatically to think of risks as threats of an outcome that's worse than the one we want, but risk can also be an opportunity of an outcome that is better than expected. So what happens if you get more people signing up to something than you expected to? What happens if you get more take up of something, more use of a resource than you expected to happen? Is both an opportunity and also thinking about threats. This is fairly self-evident really, but everything we do in United Learning carries some risk. Our job is to educate young people, and to do that as well as we possibly can. We can't do that without exposing ourselves to some risk, and it's really important actually that we do acknowledge and accept some risk in the conduct of our activity and in the course of educating young people, because if we tried to do that in a completely risk-free way, we would be doing a disservice to the young people, to the children and young people themselves. We have to help them, we have to support them as they grow, to understand risk and to navigate risk themselves. And so in doing that, we have to accept a certain amount of risk. Obviously, there are different areas in which we accept more risk and less risk, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. And really, fundamentally, almost everything we do is at some level concerned with managing risk. So thinking about school improvement, when we're thinking about our financial management, when we're thinking about safeguarding, all of that, whether we think of it as actions on a risk register or not, it is all about managing risk, and it is all about trying to reduce the variability of outcome, and reduce that sense of that uncertainty, whether threat or opportunity. So again, I think there is often a tendency when people think about risk management to leap straight to the risk register as a thing that records and codifies our assessment of risk. But I hope, as you'll see as we talk through this, it is much richer and much deeper than that. And our role in thinking about risk is much more than a periodic review of a risk register, important though that is. So the aim of risk management obviously is to think about and ensure that we do that that we manage that risk in a really systematic way, through the identification of risks, which itself has to be an ongoing process. It's not something we do once, twice, 3 times a year. It's something we're kind of assessing on a kind of ongoing basis through our work, taking action to reduce that risk to an acceptable level, which we think about in relation to our risk appetite, and then monitoring, reviewing, evaluating, learning lessons. So that is all part of, in this context, we're talking about it in terms of risk management. In another context, we might just be talking about it as doing our job. It's sort of risk is part of doing the job that we do and doing it really well. So it's not some kind of mystery thing that happens on the sidelines or happens in a kind of separate world. It's part of our day-to-day conversation. It's part of what we're doing all the time. So I've mentioned our risk appetite. The group board agrees the organisation's risk appetite annually. And in fact, that conversation will be happening this week at the Group Board Away Day. We will review the risk management framework. As part of that, the group's risk appetite is set out in that risk framework. And fundamentally, it describes the level of risk we're prepared to tolerate in pursuit of our objectives. And we in United Learning use 4 broad categories to think about our risk appetite. So for a number of our activities, our approach is risk minimizing. So which are sort of, you can see them to the right. So safeguarding, health and safety, legislative compliance, fraud, financial impropriety, continuity of learning. Those are areas where we know we have to accept some risk. We can't eliminate risk entirely in any of those areas, but our approach is to try and minimize that as far as we possibly can. And where we talk about minimizing in this context, we're really generally talking, for these areas in particular, we're really talking about minimizing the probability of the risk occurring. We accept that in these areas, if the risk does materialize, the impact of that is likely still to be pretty high. And in many of these areas, there's relatively little we can do to reduce the impact of the risk. But we can do quite a lot, and we put a lot of energy and effort into reducing the probability of the risk occurring. And so our approach in these areas, we talk about being risk minimizing. Then we have a set of areas where we talk about where we say we have some appetite for risk, but it's limited. And those are educational initiatives and short-term financial loss, where so in relation to short-term financial loss, we accept that some of the activity that we do, particularly in relation to taking on schools that require substantial turnaround activity, is likely to expose us to some level of short-term financial loss. We generally seek some kind of security against that loss. So we try to make sure that whether if it's an independent school, we're thinking about what is it, we will generally bring in schools that are strongly asset backed. And if it's an academy, we will think about bringing in. We will generally want to negotiate with the Department for Education on financial support that will help us to cushion the impact and make sure the kind of actual short-term impact on our existing schools is as low as it possibly can be. And then for educational initiatives, we will want to try new things. We don't want only to do those things that are kind of cast iron certainties that are definitely going to work. But when we try new things, we want to do that in an evidence-based way, so that we do have some appetite for risk. We accept that things don't necessarily work out the way that we initially thought they would. But we only go into things, we only pursue educational initiatives where we have a decent level of evidence that they should be successful, and a decent level of confidence that we have the capacity to implement them successfully. So we have some appetite for risk in those areas, but it is limited. And then we think about, well, areas where we have a moderate appetite for risk in relation to people, and you might find this slightly strange in some ways, reputation. And this is really because neither of these things are because we go out seeking to do risky things. But they are, so for people, we know we are only as good as our people. We are, education business is fundamentally a people business. And so we know we have to take some risk in making sure that we get the best people. And we also need to make sure that we are always that we do the right thing, regardless of whether it is always what other organisations in our situation would do. So sometimes that means taking a reasonable amount of risk, both in relation to people and in relation to reputation. So we're not always going to follow what everybody else is doing, because we will do the thing that we think is right for the children and young people in our schools, and that might mean that we're out on a bit of a limb. So this is particularly where reputation comes into this sense of moderate risk. We might do things that other people aren't doing. We might speak up when other people aren't speaking up, and that might present a reputational risk, but we accept that as long as we are confident that we're doing what we think is the right thing for the children and young people in our schools. That doesn't mean to say that we accept reputational risk that might come from those risk minimizing activities. So we don't accept reputational risk that comes from something going wrong in relation to safeguarding or health and safety, or legislative non-compliance. So that's not what we mean when we talk about moderate reputational risk. It is more about our kind of willingness to be bold and willingness to do the right thing for children and young people, even if it isn't what other people are doing. And then there is this one area where we talk about having substantial risk in relation to turnaround projects. We are fundamentally an organisation that wants to and has had significant success in taking on schools that have over in some cases many years not achieved for the children and young people in their communities. And that means that taking those projects on means we have to accept that there is a risk of failure. We have to accept that there is a risk of financial impact, and we have to accept that there will be we will try things, we will do things, and they won't necessarily work first time round. And we are, in that sense, for those turnaround projects, our trustees have agreed that we are essentially a risk-seeking organisation. If we weren't, we wouldn't take those schools on. We would only bring schools into the group where they were already doing well, where their finances were already sound, and essentially we would have a very much lower appetite for risk in those areas. But our approach as a group is not to do that, because we think that we can make a significant difference to the children and young people in those schools. And so we take a long-term view. And as I say, when I was talking about short-term financial loss, we take a long-term view that, as far as possible, is backed by security. So it's backed by some sense of, do we know that we're going to get support in the short term where we need it? And can we be confident that we have the capacity to do a good job? So we only take schools on in those circumstances where we really believe we've got the capacity to make a difference and make things better. And, clearly we may also, in taking on turnaround projects, in the short term, increase our exposure to risk in some of these other areas. So increase our exposure to risk in relation to people, or in relation to health and safety, or in relation to kind of, as I say, the finances, but we will only do so where we really believe we can make a difference and make a difference quickly. So we know that we're going to make things better in those areas. So that, as I say, is reviewed annually. It doesn't change very significantly. So the only change this year has been to add continuity of learning to the list of activities in which we seek to minimise risk. That obviously is after the experience of the last couple of years, where we have in fact done an awful lot to minimise risk in that area. But generally, that has been quite a stable articulation of our risk appetite for the last 4 or 5 years. And we have a good conversation about it every year with trustees, but it's not something that has tended to shift very much. And it does when we think about taking on projects. So when in board meetings, we will refer back to this and to think about, are we doing things that are in line with our risk appetite generally? So hopefully that's kind of useful to know that that's what that is, and to have some sense of how we think about those areas. I'm not going to go into these in very great detail. These are our risk management principles. They are, as I said earlier, not particularly groundbreaking. They are, I think, what you would expect to see in any organisation, really, to think about risk management. It has to be part of what we do all the time. It needs to be proportionate. It's an ongoing thing. It's not a moment in time. We talk about them. We make sure that they are owned. Both the risks themselves and the activity that we engage in to mitigate the risk, that all of that is really clearly owned. We all take responsibility for flagging risk rather than waiting for somebody else to notice. That's really important, that we're not thinking of it as being somebody else's job. It's part of all of our jobs all of the time. And as I said at the start, what we do to manage risk is very definitely not just about risk registers. That is a part of it, and I will talk a little bit about that later on. But the majority of our day-to-day activity is about managing risk, whether that is school improvement, whether that is recruitment and retention, whether that is budget setting. It's about understanding and assessing the level of risk, and in many cases, thinking about the way that risks interact with each other. So in fact, those three are a really good example, aren't they, of how risks in relation to school improvement, risks in relationship to people, and in relation to budgets, those risks interact with each other. We will take different judgments at different times as to which we prioritise and where we think the right emphasis is, and how we balance up that risk profile across a school and across the organisation as a whole. We do, and you do, and your LGBs do, a significant amount of work in relation to compliance, and whether that's safeguarding, health and safety, governance, data protection, information security. All of that is about identifying and managing risk, and about making sure that we comply with with expectations. So in that, we're kind of managing the risk of non-compliance. But each of those things in and of themselves is fundamentally about managing risks. The expectations are there in order to manage risk. We have common expectations as a group in order to help us ensure that we are managing risk across all of the schools in a similar way. Internal audit obviously is critical and provides assurance to the executive and to trustees about the overall level of risk to which the group is exposed, through school level audits and through central audits, and will recommend actions to reduce risk where necessary. Will give us a sense of, and that's something that the Risk and Audit Committee will look at each of its meetings, and will take an independent view from our internal auditor about the overall level of risk and how well we are doing as a group in responding and taking action where that's been identified. We obviously have a kind of overall level of risk protection through our group insurance policy. So, where insurance is a kind of classic way of managing risk, it's a classic way of risk sharing effectively, and we manage that at group level through Zurich. And then we have consistent expectations set out in our group policies, which are then adopted and adapted at school level. And again, the reason we do that at group level is in order to make sure that we've got that consistency and that we can really straightforwardly monitor compliance. So all of those things, and no doubt a number of other things that you might point to and you can think about in the course of your own activity are fundamentally about managing risk, and it's a conversation that's happening at different levels between different people, operationally, strategically, pretty much every day, everywhere in the organisation. So the risk register bit of this, because it is important to know about our expectations for risk registers. We do have a template for schools and central office teams to use. It's on the hub. It's not mandatory, but it's pretty straightforward. So if you or your heads want to use something else, that's completely fine. But there is one there for you to use. We do expect every school to have one. And at the centre, we expect all significant projects to have one. But the use of risk registers has to be proportionate. You don't want every project or every piece of work to have to be thinking about logging risk and formally on a risk register. So it's a matter for judgment both at the centre and at school level as to whether you need a risk register. What you really need is to be thinking about risk and being really clear about who owns risks and who owns any actions that need to be taken. But often, particularly at an operational level, the day-to-day business of managing risk is so dynamic that it's not going to make sense to keep recording changes on a risk register. It just ends up being bureaucratic and irritating, and will probably prevent people from doing the thing that they actually want to do. So as I say, it does have to be proportionate. We have a set of, we would think in the centre of having local risk registers, and of course we also have local risk registers in schools, which are held at school level, are reviewed by local governing bodies. It's a standing item on our LGB agendas, and something that you should have an oversight of. That doesn't mean you need to get involved in the kind of minutiae of who's doing what, but it does mean that you'd want to have kind of an overview and a sense of what the level of risk is, what the school leadership's assessment of the risk is. Gives you an opportunity to challenge and to say whether to look at is there a kind of decent rationale for why they think about risk in the way that they do. We then have a strategic risk register at the centre, which the executive team manages, is reviewed at every executive board meeting, is reviewed by Risk and Audit Committee 4 times a year and by the group board twice a year. So trustees have, I think, an increasingly strong overview of risk and an increasingly good understanding of the way that we're thinking about risk collectively. The Risk and Audit Committee carries out a deep dive review of the strategic risks on a 2-year cycle. So every 2 years, each of the strategic risks on the risk register is reviewed in an in-depth way by the Risk and Audit Committee. Those have been really, we've introduced that in the last year. Those have been really good, powerful conversations, helping trustees and our the independent members of our Risk and Audit Committee really understand how we approach kind of key risks like our people risk, our finance risk, but also things like safeguarding and health and safety. I'm not going to go into this in loads of detail. It should be to most of you a really familiar risk management cycle. We don't do anything particularly special. This is an ongoing process, starting with the identification of risk. We then assess risks on 2 dimensions: probability and impact. The critical thing to think about when you're assessing risks is to make sure that you've assessed both probability and impact on the same basis. So a kind of, I think, really common mistake in thinking about risks is to kind of assess the impact on a worst case scenario basis, and then assess the probability on a everyday something might go a bit wrong basis. So you end up with an assessment, for example, that a really high impact event, whether that might be, I don't know, in relation to the failure of something in relation to health and safety, that really high impact event has a high probability of happening. And obviously, if that is true, then that is a really big problem that you have to do something about very quickly. But mostly when people think about those risks as high, they're thinking about a really high impact event, but they're thinking about the day-to-day probability that that small incidents might happen that don't actually cause much harm. So just check and think about risk of, are you doing it on the same basis? So are you thinking about, if it's a really high impact event, what is the probability of that really high impact event actually happening? Obviously, as I say, if it is high, then you have a big, you're certainly outside the risk, our kind of risk tolerance, and you need to act to do something about it quite quickly. But generally, when you see things like that, it's because the basis hasn't, they've been thought about in a different way. You record that assessment, might be on a risk register, might be in some other way. Then you're taking action to address. In some instances, you might need to tolerate the risk, but generally we're treating risks. Generally, we're doing something about them. So if that's the case, you're then recording any actions. And then you need to be reviewing that on a regular basis. Have the actions that we've taken actually had an effect in reducing our assessment of the risk? Many of the things that we do are not going to reduce, are not going to, over time, the level of the risk is probably going to stay broadly similar. So things like, as I say, for example, if you're talking about a safeguarding event where you've got a high impact, if something really badly goes wrong, that's going to be maybe low probability. You're not going to be, your actions are about keeping it stable rather than necessarily about definitely bringing that level down over time. But you're always wanting to review, learn lessons, think about aligning that with other planning and reporting cycles, learning lessons. If you can close risks, then do. If you need to escalate, if things kind of actually materialize and become issues, there are obviously processes for doing that. That's all set out in a little bit more detail in the risk management framework, but it is hopefully reasonably straightforward. Roles and responsibilities are also set out in more detail in the risk management framework, but at a high level, this is what we're looking at, a kind of delineation between the risk governance and oversight, which sits with the board and its committees, risk infrastructure and management, making sure that we have the right resources in the right places to manage the risk, the right people to manage risks across the organisation as a whole, which is the responsibility of the executive team, and then risk ownership, which, as I say, includes this cycle, the identify, assess, address, monitor and review cycle, and covers and it includes then a whole set of things that we do operationally to make sure that we're thinking about risk in a kind of both measured and comprehensive way. So as I say, those roles and responsibilities are set out in a bit more detail in the risk management framework, and if it's helpful, we can talk about those later. This is our escalation framework for if risks can't be managed. So if anyone feels that they own a risk but they can't contain that risk at the level that they are operating, then that must be escalated. So there's lots of arrows on here, but hopefully it is reasonably clear to see a kind of flow upwards, both within central office and in each school, through to leadership teams, through in schools to the LGB, being aware of the need for escalation, and ultimately, if risks need to keep being escalated, it would go through to the regional director or the head of independent schools, through to the executive board, and ultimately to the group board. There are very few individual school risks that we can't manage without taking them without escalation through to the group board. But I would say that in the way that we think about reporting to the board, we are always flagging we're always thinking about how we flag local risks. So the board at each of its meetings, for example, has a report on the primary and the secondary academies and on the independent schools, and in that kind of current risks and issues will always be identified and will always be flagged with the action that's being taken to deal with them. So it's not that the board doesn't see and doesn't have an awareness of risk at school level. It's just that generally, kind of when we're thinking about changing our approach to or sort of escalate in the way we think about escalation, that's generally as a kind of for information rather than a need to involve the board in changing the approach to a particular school. And of course, we have the link trustees who also attend regular meetings to talk through any issues at school level, which happen on a cycle every half term. So we have a primary academies, a secondary academies, and an independent schools cycle of meetings every Monday morning. So that again is another way for trustees to get awareness and understanding of the of risk and issues at school level. This is just a summary of the current state of our strategic risk register. So as you'll see, we assess, we give a RAG rating to every risk, and we have an inherent rating before action is taken, and then a residual rating after the actions that we've discussed. These are, again, a fairly consistent set of risks that we monitor over time. We aim for the strategic risk register to cover the risks that an organisation of our type should always be worrying about. So even those things that are where we've got risks that are green at the bottom, they are still things that we know that we need to keep an overview of on a regular basis. So they don't disappear off the strategic risk register, they stay there. Obviously, as long as things are going well, we don't dwell on them in any kind of other than in our kind of annual cycle. We won't dwell on them in loads of detail, but it's really important that we kind of keep them there and keep them, keep the attention, and the risk register is updated on a regular basis right across that set of risks. Pleasingly, in most areas, the residual rating is a lower RAG rating than the inherent rating. There are some areas, so safeguarding is one where the residual rating is unlikely ever to come very much lower than that for the reasons I talked about at the beginning. So our because across a group of our size and complexity, we judge that the probability of something happening that could cause harm is still not negligible, and that leaves us with still a red rating. Red risks are. It's important to think of red risks as risks that just need to be actively managed all the time, and that is indeed our approach with safeguarding. We manage it very proactively. We don't leave anything to chance. There is a bit actually, an addition to the risk management framework this year is an annex kind of explaining why, for the reasons that I've just set out, why we still view these red risks as being within our risk tolerance. So although the kind of we talk about risk minimizing in these areas, we accept that the RAG rating is likely to leave some of them at any one time as being RAG rated red. It just means we just need to keep actively managing them. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are outside our risk tolerance as set out in the risk appetite. So hopefully you'll have picked up some of the things that I think are the kind of really important role of the LGB as I've gone through this presentation. I won't labour the point, but risk management is all of our responsibility. We all need to be thinking about what are the things that could stop us achieving our objectives, and how do we mitigate the risk. And governors, chairs of governors, have just as an important role in that as the staff of the school, as colleagues in the central team. the slightly smaller text there is what the United Learning Risk Management Framework says about the role of local governing bodies responsible for overseeing risk management at a local level, regular review of the risk register, and the approval of school level policies, which are and kind of monitoring of compliance with those policies, which is obviously a kind of important part of again on the kind of standing on the regular agenda cycle. The risk register is, as I said, a standing item on the LGB agenda. Really important, your role in asking questions. What does the head, what do the leadership team think are the main risks to delivering, for example, the school improvement plan? What is the main risk to achieving the budget? Ask those questions as a way, both of improving your understanding, but also of making sure that leaders have got good answers to those questions, and that you're kind of bringing that conversation into your LGB meetings. And you have a role, I think, as well in really championing compliance activity, in really making sure that, do you know whether actions following audits, for example, are being completed? Have you got the information that you need to know whether the school is compliant? And making sure that we don't let those things slip, and that we do keep up the where things have been identified as needing attention, that activity is happening, and that it's been signed off, and it's been reported back to the centre, and that the kind of loop is closed in relation to compliance and in relation to audits. So there is the link, and I'm sure Leslie will share these slides afterwards so that you actually have the link itself. There is a link to the United Learning Risk Management Framework on the hub. As I say, if you haven't seen it before, do take a look. I'd be very grateful for any feedback that you have, particularly if there are any bits of it that are unclear. As I say, we do review it once a year. We will be discussing it with the board this week, and issuing a revised version shortly after this week's conversation. But at any point, if you read it and you think, oh, I just didn't quite get that, or it'd be really good if it said something about X and X isn't in there, do let me know. Yeah, always it's something we want to keep as a living document and keep improving, and make sure it's useful to people. So I am going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see people again. There we go.
So I've got a couple of questions that have come through the chat, Anna, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
So the first one is around educational outcomes. I noticed that educational outcomes aren't considered within risk categories. Some might consider that schools achieving UK average performance are a significant risk to UK futures economic, social performance.
So yeah, so they are considered. So we have school performance is a risk on our strategic risk register. What they're not is we don't have them as a separate category in thinking about our risk appetite. You're absolutely right. Essentially because all of the other things in our risk appetite will affect school performance, as well as and so where we're talking, for example, about educational initiatives or people or turnaround projects, that is in relation to the impact that might have on outcomes, as well as on finance, as well as on other things. So it's absolutely fundamental to the way we think about risk, is thinking about school outcomes. It's just they're not a separate category in relation to risk appetite, but it is a really important. It is one of our strategic risks on the strategic risk register, and okay. I would expect, I think, it to be a risk category in every school risk register.
Yeah. Okay. So another question directly related to the risk escalation flow diagram. And it says, as I'm not party to internal UL information flow, can you illustrate this in a little more detail? For example, do the trustees, senior executives have access to a traffic light report of risks across UL schools?
So we don't collect the kind of traffic lights from each individual school's risk register. And we wouldn't monitor school risk registers at that level of detail. But through the reports that regional directors are producing and providing, on schools. So that feeds through, as I say, into the Monday morning meetings that Link trustees are at. We'll have a particular focus in those on schools that we consider to be, I guess, the kind of highest priority, the highest risk, but that's we would talk about every school at some point over the course of the year. So yeah, so we don't collect the individual ratings of individual school risk registers, although those will be, the risk registers themselves, for example, will be looked at, and or at least making sure that they exist in school level audits that internal audit would do, and would feed through into other compliance activity. But no, we wouldn't collect that at that level.
And we were asked, please could you say a little more about the difference between inherent and residual risk in relation to a school?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally this is the same as what I would think about this in the same way in relation to a school as I do in relation to strategic risks across the organisation. Fundamentally, the inherent risk is the risk before you've done anything about it. So, what would the risk of a significant safeguarding incident be if you had taken no action? So generally, inherent risks are going to be quite high. Both the impact and the probability of those risks is going to be quite high, unless they are things that aren't. There sometimes we think about risks that are I guess slightly more peripheral to the day-to-day running of a school, but I think most things that you're going to look at as an LGB and that are going to come on school level risk registers are going to be quite high, both in terms of impact and probability. And then the residual risk is once you've taken the action in the risk identified in the risk register. So you can accept that some things have already happened, but once you've taken the additional activity, once you've done the additional activity that is identified in the risk register, what risk is left? And it's the residual risk really that you're worrying about, because that's the risk that if you're happy with the way the risk register looks, then that's the level of risk you're accepting. So the question you might want to be asking, if the residual risk is still pretty high, is, are we happy that we're doing everything we can to bring it down? And are we happy that there's nothing more we could be doing to reduce this level of risk to something that we'd be more comfortable with? As I say, in some cases you've got to be realistic, and you've got to be realistic that in some of the areas we're talking about, if the risk materializes, the impact will be pretty significant. So you want to then focus on, are we reducing the probability of the risk occurring to something that we're comfortable with?
Thank you. So a question here on the strategic risk register screenshot, there was a P and an L in the columns. I take it that P is probability, but what is L is asked, and how do you summarise up from the detailed risks below the strategic level, or is it just discussion?
So L is in fact likelihood, but probability is I think that might be. I was going to say at P and L, I think I might have that's probably a typo, isn't it? So I think I'll just have to make sure no one's picked that up previously. So thank you, whoever picked that up. I've done this presentation several times. No one's yet picked that one up. But yeah, so probability stroke likelihood, you could say, is one, and then impact is the other. And how do we summarize up? It is, broadly speaking, it's discussion. So there is I think of risk management as, it's often when we talk about risk management, it sounds like it sounds more like a science, but there is, in the end, it is judgment. And in the end, it's a discussion. We have as I say, we talk about the risk register every time we meet as an executive board, and we will have a discussion about that is based on our kind of understanding of the context, on our understanding of the picture across our schools, of how things have changed outside of United Learning, how things are changing within United Learning, and what is our broad judgment about the level both of the probability and the potential impact if the risk were to materialise. So we don't go through a process of kind of bringing together all of the risk registers that might sit underneath it and doing some fancy calculation for aggregation. But we will have those things. We will have those things in our mind as we're discussing it.
Okay, so three questions here from Shane. To what extent should governors be suggesting the items for inclusion on the risk register versus the school providing the items for themselves? I'll let you answer that one, and then we'll go on to the next, if that's all right.
Yeah, so I think I think you should broadly be looking for the school to suggest items, but I think it's completely legitimate for you to look at the risk register and ask questions of if there is something that you would expect to see in there that you're not seeing. So you know, and in fact, I think you should do that. And certainly, you know, when I'm thinking at a strategic level and the relationship between the exec and the trustees, that's exactly what happens. So we have, you know, the executive determines what sits on the strategic risk register, and then we talk about that with trustees. And if trustees think actually this, you know, there's something missing here, then we'll have a good conversation. You know, I hope mostly a good conversation about why in our judgment we hadn't included it, and sometimes it will result in something being added to the risk register that wasn't there in the first place. And I'd hope that you could have that kind of conversation with leaders, with school leaders at a local level. You probably don't need to have that level. You probably might not want to have that level of conversation every time you talk about the risk register, but maybe once a year it's helpful to have a kind of slightly more in-depth review in which, you know, governors and the head and senior leadership team think about, is this, you know, is this where have we got everything we think we should have here? I think that sort of pulls on to the second point here about SWOT and SWOT analysis. Absolutely, I think that's a really good thing to encourage. You know, whether it's a SWOT tool or it's some kind of horizon scanning review of, you know, does this risk register capture everything we think it should do? Schools are developing and changing all the time. Are there things on there that no longer need to be on there because actually they're just managed in a kind of, you know, they don't need to be managed at the level of the school risk register anymore? Yeah, the more it can be a living document and the more people kind of think about it in the round, the better that conversation will be. And again, that's something we try to do at the centre. And then the final one there is guidance about how often SLT need to review the review the register. So we do leave that for the school to decide. But given that it's a standing item on LGB agendas and LGBs are meeting at least once termly, I think your suggestion that it should be at least termly is a sensible one. That they should have looked at it ideally before it comes to you. So that at least they've had a conversation about, you know, are they comfortable with what's reported in the risk register? Have they looked at the actions? Have they checked that, you know, whether things have changed significantly? But we don't specify that for school leadership teams, but I termly seems proportionate and sensible to me.
Thank you. I don't think there's anything else come through the chat. I had a couple of questions in one governing body meeting that I've reserved for you. So one was, why don't we get to see the central risk register? And this was from a colleague who works elsewhere, where that's apparently the practice, that all of the schools get the risk register from the central trust and they put their lines in it. So that was a question.
So I think that's a really good question, and I'll take it. I'm actually going to borrow it and take it to the conversation that we're going to have with trustees later this week, because I think it's a good question.
Well, then, to you.
I don't think we would. I think given the size of and scale of group we are, I wouldn't propose that we extend that to schools adding lines to it.
These are shared. Apparently, these are shared thematically.
Okay.
They're shared as a thematic. These are the areas that the trust is looking at. Yeah. And the schools are invited to consider how they contribute to the mitigations of those risks at school level.
Okay. I think certainly that conversation is worth thinking about how we do that in a way that is manageable both for the school and for us at the centre. But I don't. Yeah. Let me take that away and we'll have a think about it. I think that's it's a sensible suggestion.
And then the other one that was asked, I was kind of squaring this particular circle, was around operational and strategic, and it went along the lines of our role as governors is a strategic one. The mitigations of risks tends to be on the ground an operational activity. So what makes a good question?
So
that's a great question, but
that's a really good question, and it's exactly the kind of discussion that we're having with trustees. So we had that I think mirrors the journey that we've been on with trustees over the last couple of years, where I would characterize the conversation with risk and audit 2 years ago was that we gave them our strategic risk register, and that was pretty much it. And they got this document, which is a big document, and it's pretty unwieldy. It was quite difficult for them to read because the text is quite small, and they're often looking at it on screen. And they, with a few changes of trustees, found that very hard to engage with. And the work that we've done over the last couple of years has been on getting to a much better conversation about what actually, on the one hand, what actually day to day are we worrying about as an executive team? So I think that's a really good question, and one that you can always be asking is, what are the things that are kind of concerning you right now, in the which will be inevitable, will almost always be dimensions of the risks that are on the risk register, but they won't be the kind of that takes you out of the operational. And that question that I flagged on the slides of kind of what are the things that might get in the way, so when if you're talking about school improvement plan, if you're talking about the budget, if you're talking about other, whatever activity you're talking about, just keep asking that question of what could get in the way of us achieving what we want to achieve here. So that kind of getting into the talking about risk. And in relation to the risk register, if you're reviewing the risk register, just take a look at the relative RAG ratings of some of those risks. Do they look right? Do they look odd to you? Are some risks that you would expect to be, flagged as red or amber actually being flagged as green? And ask why those ratings have been arrived at, and are heads really confident that the actions are going to get you to kind of a green level. So yeah, I think those questions that are at a kind of not digging down into individual actions, because that's not appropriate for governors, but what's the collective impact of those actions? Are they going to collectively reduce the risk to something that you're comfortable with?
Really helpful. I should have had you in that meeting. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Anna?
There's one there about where does political risk get considered. That's a really good question.
That's a good question.
So at the strategic level, it gets considered. We think about possible effects or possible triggers. So for example, in relation, this comes out, I think, most often in relation to school performance and financial, the finance risk, where we will think about how is the kind of political and policy environment going to affect what we can do within United Learning. So obviously some of those things are things that we just have to accept are outside of our control, and our risk mitigation is then about how do we respond to the things that are outside of our control? How do we get ourselves into a position where we're resilient to deal with political shock or political changes? But that will happen quite a lot. We have in the past used, kind of, as well as SWOT, we've used the kind of classic PESTLE tool as a way of assessing kind of what's changing, what's going on politically and socially, and all the other things that PESTLE stands for. So yeah. And yes, the biggest risk to a school is one that can't be sorted out within a term. Yes, that is often the case. So that's and you shouldn't, I don't think you should see it as a failure of risk management that the risk rating doesn't change, or that actions remain as present on a risk register for a long period of time. That isn't a failure of risk management. That is that is someone identifying sensibly things that need to happen. I do think you should expect leaders to have a sense of on what timescale or over what duration should we expect to see this action having an effect on the risk that we're talking about. So if it's school performance, for example, over what timescale would you expect that to to lead to an improvement in outcomes if we do the things that we say we're going to do. But absolutely, you don't expect things to just get sorted out within a term. Lots of these things are, you know, pretty intractable and difficult to solve.
It's all gone very quiet now. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. I think that's been a really useful session, and I've certainly written lots of things to take back to my governing bodies, and I've seen people doing similar on the screen, so I'm sure that's been of great use. I will finish the recording now, and just to say that, as Anna said,